So our next speaker and next panel is just, from our perspective as the forum, we're just incredibly honored and privileged to have Steve Case and Ron Brownstein to, in essence, to have a conversation of, where our immigration system is going and how our immigration system needs to serve America and America's economy. And I'll let Ron introduce Steve, but I'll steal a little bit of thunder and really want to thank Steve for his leadership efforts on the Jobs Act from the last couple of years, his leadership efforts on startup visas and entrepreneurial visas, and to make sure that our the high skill portion of our economy, as well as our entire economy, continues to prosper and move forward. And to interview Steve today, we're thrilled to have Ron Brownstein, who is editorial director for the National Journal and political analyst for ABC and CNN. And Ron, in case you have never read any of his things, I would highly recommend it. And not only for the clarity of his analysis, but his ability to knit together polling data, demographic data, and frankly, where the country is going in terms of policy on the Hill, but also demographically as a nation. So, Ron, Steve, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for having us. Steve Case, business leader, founder of AOL, activist on issues relating to startup companies. Today, I think the question, a lot of people would wonder as we begin to move into a more serious conversation about immigration reform, is that we are coming out of the worst economic downturn since the Depression. We are still looking at elevated levels of unemployment, millions of Americans who can't find work. Why is this a time to be talking about perhaps bringing more people into the country and reforming the immigration system?
So let's get right into it.
Yeah.
First of all, I just want to say it's great to see everybody. And I've lived now in Washington for almost 30 years, and I don't think we've ever had weather quite like this in December. So whoever's bringing the good weather, please stay a little bit longer. It's great to see. And it's also great to have everybody coming together to try to forge a consensus. And when I heard there was a conference on Bibles, badges, and business, I said, well, I'm there. Going back to the question, the way I would frame it is, and I do bring a prism and a bias, I guess, around the central role entrepreneurs have played, is America was a startup over 200 years ago. It was a startup with an idea and some people willing to kind of take a chance on that idea. And the reason the nation is built to the degree it has and has such a strong economy, the leading economy in the world, is the work of entrepreneurs taking risks, not just building companies, but building entire industries. That is the story of America. Entrepreneurship is central to it. And as we all know, a central part of that story is the role immigrants have played and immigrant entrepreneurs have played. Because it was a startup, in some ways we all are immigrants, and many of the most successful companies that have really defined the nation, defined and built the economy, ranging from companies like AT&T a century ago to Google more recently, were started by immigrant entrepreneurs. So if you want to continue to have a strong, robust economy, you want to figure out some way to get a growth rate of 2% up, which most people think is too low, and I certainly agree it's too low. You want to figure out how to get an unemployment rate of 8% down, and you want to make sure we remain competitive in what is a more competitive global world. The place to focus is around innovation and entrepreneurship, and the role of immigration is central to that discussion. So I do worry that there's a risk as a nation that we kind of slip into kind of complacency. Other nations around the world are, as you know, stepping up their efforts. They've recognized sort of the secret sauce that's driven the American economy is entrepreneurship, and they're changing their policies, including on immigration, but also on capital and on research and other things, to try to become more competitive so the industries of the next 100 years are based there, not based here. So I view this in the context, there's a political context, obviously, and because of the election, we're sitting in Washington, it's unavoidable. There is a moral context, and many of you coming from different faith communities kind of recognize that. There's also an economic context, and I think it's important to frame this as an economic issue. It is a political issue, it is a moral issue, but it's also an economic issue, and that's really what kind of led me to focus on it. And while the focus, particularly given the nature of what I've been trying to do around entrepreneurship, has been more around the high-skilled immigration issue, STEM visas, entrepreneurship visas, things like that. I recognize there is a broader issue that needs attention. I'm sick of hearing people, I'm sure everybody else here is even more sick of it, hearing people talk about things and not come together, forge a consensus, and get something done. So I think there is an opening now. Exactly how it plays out over the coming months, time will tell, and I think it will ultimately be driven in part by efforts of groups like this. But it really is critical if we're going to continue to build on what's made America great, to recognize that entrepreneurship is a key part of that, and immigration is a key part of that.
Well, we'll talk about the opening in a few minutes, but let me ask you to kind of reflect broadly on what is the role of the immigration system? What are the kind of changes in the immigration system that would be needed to contribute to kind of a renewal of the economy, an acceleration of growth? What ways can the immigration system contribute to that?
Well, I think there's, again, the area I've been principally focused is around the high-skilled immigration issue. So I want to talk about that, but also talk about other things like the DREAM Act and the broader need for comprehensive reform. As it relates to the first, high-skilled immigration, the data here is pretty compelling. Number one, the Kauffman Foundation that tracks this basically says that over the last 3 decades, 40 million jobs have been created by young, high-growth companies, and it accounts for all the net job growth. So if you're focused on jobs and getting unemployment down, the place to focus is on entrepreneurship. How do you get more companies up and running and started? Number one. Number two, the role immigrants have played in achieving that, as I mentioned before, is central. And it's particularly true in the technology space. About half of the companies in Silicon Valley are started by first or second generation immigrants. But it's also true all over the
Yep. Phones and BlackBerries, probably.
Technology, I tell you. Some of the great companies. I'll give you one example. There's a guy who took over a failed factory in upstate New York 6 years ago, out of business. Excuse me 1 second while I try to contribute to making sure we are not making a lot of noise. Failed factory. Decided to buy it and rebuild it, and decided to essentially come up with a new form of yogurt, Greek yogurt. That company now, Chobani, will do $1 billion of sales this year, and it's the #1 yogurt brand 6 years ago. So it took a failed factory in upstate New York and basically has built it to one of the most successful companies. Actually, last week, Ernst & Young does a competition called Entrepreneur of the Year. The awards were last week or maybe the week before, and he won as Entrepreneur of the Year in the United States for this story. So the technology side of it is obviously important. There's some great companies that have been fueled by technology and has created a lot of innovation and growth and jobs. But there are also many other companies that are not technology companies that are part of the entrepreneurial economy, and many of them are also started by immigrants. So the first is the high-skilled immigration. I helped work on it. There are 4 senators. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats introduced something called the Startup Act 2.0 about 6 months ago. Marco Rubio of Florida, Republican, Mark Warner of Virginia, a Democrat, Chris Coons of Delaware, a Democrat, Jerry Moran of Kansas, Republican, joined together to create a roadmap around entrepreneurship, building on the Jobs Act, which provided access to capital, a whole series of things, and high-skilled immigration was one piece. There was a creation of a STEM visa and an immigration entrepreneur visa. So I think that really is important because the data says they are job makers, not job takers, that the kind of things they do and the kind of companies they build can create opportunities for lots of people, like the Chobani example. So that is really important, and making sure we win the global battle for talent and get the best engineers and entrepreneurs to come here and stay here is critical. And right now, as you probably know, about half of the people who are going to our great research universities, getting PhDs and masters at Carnegie Mellon or MIT or Stanford or what have you, are from other nations. But over a third of them then leave to go back to their countries, in many cases because they're not allowed to stay. And what do? They create companies there that compete with companies here. So that piece of it is insane. That's really critical because they really are the pioneers, the innovators, are creating these companies that can create a lot of growth and opportunity and jobs. The DREAM Act piece, I think, I know it's sensitive, but those are people, in my opinion, call it 1 million, 1.5 million, who basically are on a path to get a college degree or serve in the military, and clearly on a path to contribute to society and either start or help staff some of these companies. And having more educated, committed people that really want to make a mark in the world is the other part of building the economy. And the third, which is, as you well know, better than I, that's the most sensitive piece, around 10, 11 million people that are undocumented. Many of those are in industries like agriculture or hospitality, where they are a critical part of those industries, and if they weren't part of it, those industries would be less competitive and less successful, and we'd see less growth. So all three pieces, even though I focus more on the high-skilled piece, because I think that kind of drives the growth around the whole economy, all three pieces are important and are critical if we're going to kind of not just solve this from a political standpoint, but put the right context in place to fuel the next round of economic growth.
Do they need to be dealt with together, or could you deal with them separately?
Well, this is sort of the tough political question here. They could be dealt with separately, and there clearly is a camp that I've heard a lot of voices that say, in order to get some things done, start doing some things, put some points on the boards and start doing
House
doing
Republicans,
something.
the House passed the high-tech.
STEM bill that passed last week, but it was controversial because it didn't have this diversity lottery in it. That was an example of dealing with something in a more narrow context. There are others who say, including the president has been pretty clear on this, that he supports high-skilled immigration, but he also wants to link it to the DREAM Act and get that both done as a package. And there are others who say, particularly now, post-election, well, let's get into it here, and let's instead of just solving this in a piecemeal fashion, let's try to solve it all at once and really deal with comprehensive immigration reform. I think there's arguments for and against each of those three paths. So the question is, what happens in the coming months? Mostly in Congress. What is the consensus around the right path forward? My view is that it's important to get as much done as we can, as quickly as we can. So I think trying to kind of start moving down the path and start putting some points on the board is critical. If there is a consensus, and hopefully there will be, on a broader solution, sort of the comprehensive immigration reform, clearly that's better because we have to solve the problem. Why don't we just solve it now? But if there was complexities around that and you could still get meaningful reform that moves the ball forward, such as the Startup Act around high-skilled immigration or the DREAM Act, that would strike me as good progress. But I know that's one of the topics of this group and other what is the right way to push this down the field. My caution, this is the area of you know far better than I, because I spend a little bit of time on these policy issues, and every time I spend time on them, I even talked to a couple people in Congress this morning, it reminds me why I'm staying as an entrepreneur in the private sector, because I don't have the patience or the whatever to actually be in the. I respect people who are willing to do it, but it's sort of kind of strikes me as kind of a lot of brain damage. But how do you? It's just complicated to figure out how to get these things done. But how do you start moving the ball down the field? And as I said, as a cautioning, I think there's a risk on both sides. And I've already heard some rumblings of this. And again, you've probably heard more. There is one camp, mostly Democrats, that basically say, we won the election, the president has a mandate, basically the Republicans lost largely because they lost the Hispanic vote. If I believe the statistics you know better, is Romney had the same percentage of people who voted for him as George W. Bush had from the Hispanic community, probably would have won. That was sort of the, and therefore they need to get right on immigration, and they'll move quickly to compromise, so we should go for everything and compromise on nothing. I think that's a mistake. The other side basically says, the Republican side, some of what I've heard, says, well, the president did win, understand that, but the House is still controlled by the Republicans, and if you look at, partly because of redistricting, which I think has a unfortunate unintended consequence on our politics, that most of the people in the House are in relatively safe districts, and they actually will get punished if they try to compromise and come to the center on some of these issues. So we're not going to compromise. White House may think they're going to get something done. The Senate may think they want to get something done, but we're going to hold tough and not move to the center. So I think there's risk on both sides of people overplaying their hand. And my hope is in the coming months people will realize that while, as I said at the very beginning, while there is a political context and political calculation, obviously that's people are going to make those calculations. There is a moral dimension to this that people should also be focused on. Then there is an economic dimension to this, and getting it right sooner rather than later is important, but we'll see.
You know, there's a structural, come back to the policy later, there's beneath the, beyond the redistricting issue, Republicans, by and large in the House, are in districts that are largely unaffected by the demographic changes that are kind of fueling. Only about 10% of them are in districts that are even 1/5 Hispanic. So it's a very different. 80% of the House Republicans are in districts that are more white than the national average. So it's kind of an interesting structural problem, which kind of goes to the challenge of the
issue here on the Republican side is the president did win, congratulations, but 48% of people didn't support it, so it's not like this overwhelming mandate. And all these statements are true, but the question is, do people move out of their silos, looking at the facts and interpreting them their way, or they come out of their silos and actually try to forge a consensus to get something done?
I was going to ask you, because the last time this made serious progress, 2006, under a Republican president, Republican House, Republican Senate, 62 senators voted to pass a comprehensive bill that included a pathway to citizenship. Almost 24, it's hard to imagine now, almost 24 Senate Republicans voted to legalize the 11 million undocumented. But as part of that, the effort in there, the business community was very visible and active in supporting the comprehensive solution, working with a Republican president. What do you anticipate this time? I mean, you have been outspoken about the need to deal with these issues. We haven't seen, I don't think, as much visibility from the kind of organized business community as we did in '06, certainly. What would you expect if there is a serious effort in 2013 to look at these issues again and maybe to move forward? What would you expect from the business community?
I'd be optimistic, but I would say the business community, like anything, has different segments, different sectors, and it's hard to generalize. I'd say the business community broadly, and this is large companies particularly, are more focused right now on the fiscal issues, the fiscal cliff and reform there, and a clear signal in terms of what the financial footing of the nation is going to be and what the tax policies and so forth is going to be. So that sort of is clearly going to get in the next month or two, it's going to take a lot of the oxygen out of the room, and because it is an important issue and does need attention. The broader issue around immigration, I think there is a lot of interest, but again, there's sectors. There are large businesses that have certain interests. There are startups that we talked about have certain interests, and technology startups have a particular interest. There are industry sectors, as I mentioned, things like hospitality and agriculture that have a particular interest. I think the challenge is to get the fiscal path clearer. So there's some progress, some momentum there, and then build a consensus where people really do feel like now is the time something can get done, and it's time to engage and make it a priority. If people feel like there's a lot of talk on both sides, but people are really talking past each other, they likely are not going to be willing to, in terms of generalizing the business sector, to jump in. If they feel like this is a moment and something can get done, and there is broad bipartisan support is building to get something done, particularly something broader as opposed to something narrow, I think they will engage. So I think they're kind of will be reading the tea leaves. I'm not. Part of the reason I'm spending time on it, and part of the reason I'm at this and doing some other things like this, I do think this is a moment. I do think it's an opportunity, and shame on us we don't capitalize on it as an opportunity to try to build some momentum.
What's the moment? What is the opportunity? What is the opportunity that's been created by this election? Because some people would say, well, look, we ended up with the same alignment of power that we had before that was so dysfunctional. We have, Obama reelected, and as you say, not reelected overwhelmingly, a smaller margin of victory, fewer electoral college votes than the last time. Democrats hold the Senate, Republicans hold the House. Why is there an opportunity now that wasn't there a year ago?
Well, I think because I was involved in some of these discussions with some folks in Congress 6 months ago about the Startup Act. I think there was a sense that the issue of the Startup Act, there are many components to it, but the high school immigration piece was an important context, was kind of like, now's not the time to engage on that issue. Let's wait and see what happens in November. And people probably were making their calculation, maybe starting in January, they'd be holding better cards or worse cards for whatever subsequent negotiation would happen. But they did freeze things because people were kind of saying, well, let me just see what the landscape looks like in a few months. So it kind of froze things. I think we're a little unfrozen now, a little unstuck now. I think there is you follow this more than I, but a little bit of I wouldn't call it a battle, but a discussion in the Republican Party. What is the path forward? And there are different views, and still pretty different,
Yes,
very
yes.
different views, but I think some sense that things might come together. But as I said, I think it's incumbent on both sides not to overplay their hand, because nothing's going to get done unless people really genuinely want to get something done and genuinely willing to compromise and to say, no, it's my way or the highway, and is not going to work here. And the business community, I think, probably is cynical that is one of these issues that sort of, it's a sensitive issue, it's an emotional issue, and if it's sort of a third rail issue, and unless there really is momentum and really is a bipartisan consensus, maybe it's just not one worth kind of.
Because it's taken an enormous amount of, I mean, it will require, it has already required and will require further an enormous amount of work just to recreate what was put together in 2006. I mean, as I say, you had 23, I believe, Senate Republicans voting for a comprehensive package. You had a broad coalition that included business as well as what you might expect, church groups, immigration groups, as well as labor, which has been cool as well. Let me ask you specifically about the STEM area, because that's one that on the surface is relatively less controversial. The idea of, if someone has a PhD, we should what's the phrase, staple a green card to the diploma. But you get two lines of criticism about this. One, and when you wrote a piece on this in the Atlantic, one of our publications, you could read in the comments, inevitably, whenever this comes up or the H-1B issue comes up, there will be people saying, what? There are U.S. engineers, U.S. trained engineers who are out of work. The problem is not that we don't have enough trained people. The problem is that either salaries are not good enough, they're not bringing people into the industry, and why should we be looking to bring in more folks when we have so many of our own who are having trouble with employment?
Well, it ties into the issue of immigration being so emotional and sensitive, and people kind of sort of knee-jerk reactions on both sides to some of these issues. My answer is the data doesn't support that. If you talk to a lot of companies, they really are hungry for people, particularly with the engineering degrees that are necessary for more and more of the jobs. It's not just a technology sector per se. Thinking of Silicon Valley as sort of the the icon of technology. Almost every business now is becoming a technology business. Walmart, for example, which is a retail business, has a huge use of technology. Under Armour, an athletic wear brand, uses a huge amount of technology. So almost any business to be successful has to become a technology business, and they need the engineers who can understand kind of what's happening and some of the new trends around mobile and other sorts of things. So it becomes critical, and they are hungry for those jobs. The second thing I would say is, again, the debate is charged, but there are 310 million people in this country. Even the debate around undocumented is about 11 million, I think is the number I've seen. The STEM visa proposal was 50,000 visas. The STEM, there was also an entrepreneur visa investor program, 75,000 visas. In the context of what we're talking about, it's tiny, and so and the evidence is overwhelming that these people are the innovators and job creators that create companies that ultimately can have hundreds or thousands, sometimes even tens of thousands. A company like Intel, tens of thousands of employees of all kinds of different skill sets. So making sure we win that battle. The thing I'm most fearful of is that these other countries that are stepping up their efforts. Australia, as an example, on a per capita basis, has 10 times more visas for engineers and entrepreneurs in the United States. 10 times. Because they basically have about the same number, but we're 10 times bigger. So, and they're not alone. Most countries are saying, well, we want to get as many smart, trained people as we can to come to our countries, because that's how we're going to win the next battle and win the next industry. So it's really important that we deal with that.
I'll bring the audience in for questions in a few minutes, but yeah, in fact, there was a study put out yesterday by the OECD ranking countries by the share of their immigrants with advanced degrees, and there are many that ranked higher than the U.S.
And if you look at any company, though, entrepreneurial companies for sure, but even larger Fortune 500 companies, they'll all say the same thing. The most important thing in terms of building a successful, innovative organization is people. Your ability to attract and retain people. That is the main event. If we're, as an investor, as a venture capitalist, when I invest in companies, the most important thing to look at is actually not the idea, it is the people, the team. That's what you're betting on. You're kind of, partly betting on the idea, partly on the overall trend, but mostly on the people, mostly on the team. So the critical ingredient to getting a successful company going is attracting talent. That's true for any organization, and that's true for any country. So if we're successful in being a magnet for talent, and some of this is not just trying to be a magnet for people coming from other countries, obviously. A lot of it is improving our own education, particularly around STEM, so that we are training more people in this country for the jobs of the future.
Perfect leading, because the other concern I wanted to ask you about on the STEM front was this question of whether, in effect, our strategy is becoming to go, whether we are saying it is easier to find the best and the brightest from around the world, bring them here, get them degrees, and convince them to stay, than it is to get a kid from South Central or East LA through Stanford with an engineering degree. That, in effect, rather than focusing on our own human capital, that we are basically saying it's easier to go bring in the best and the brightest from around the world. And that's a fundamentally different choice in terms of what the real imperative is.
But it's not really, because there's no choice. You have to do both. You have to reinvent your education system, be more relevant for the future. It hasn't changed that much in 100 years. The world's changed a lot in 100 years, and we have to shift not just K-12, but higher ed and into a different realm, which is more around active, personalized learning. There's no question about that, and have to create a culture and incentives that celebrate the work of engineers, because they are becoming critically important, as I said, for every kind of company, not just for technology companies. So clearly we have to do that, and there's a lot of effort underway to focus on that. And it's hard, and it's complicated, and there's no kind of easy fixes, and we have to do everything we possibly can. But meanwhile, if there are other people, think of it more like you're the Washington Redskins, who last night had a really good game for those watching Monday Night Football. You have a team on the field, but they're constantly looking to recruit additional players to augment the team and have the best possible talent on the field. That's what we have to do as a nation as well. And so trying to build talent in terms of identifying people early and building them up is the main way people got to build teams, again, across many different organizations, but also be on the lookout for people that could be drafted, in essence, to come to your company or come to your football team or come to your nation, I think is critically important. You have to do both. So it's a false choice to say that we basically should not be trying to win the global battle for talent around high skill immigration, because we should just focus on improving our own education system. Of course we need to do that. But meanwhile, there are tens of thousands of people that are coming to our universities, getting our education, many of whom would like to stay here, that we're kicking out. And that's stupid, and we have to stop it.
Is the immigration system the principal reason they're leaving, or is there also a sense there may be more opportunity where they came from?
It's both, but this is why it's a scary issue, frankly. What you see in these kind of things is sort of, you see a little bit of a tipping point. That I think 10 years ago, it was more clear that people would come here for the education and the opportunity. And they were tending to stay here because their home country didn't necessarily have an economy that was robust. That has begun to change. So some are saying, even if you let me stay here, I will want to go back. But still a lot do want to stay who we force to go back. As more and more people do go back, it does create a dynamic, sort of an entrepreneurial ecosystem starts building up. And as over time it gets more and more robust, and that becomes more and more competitive, it'll be harder to keep people. Even if we're having the same debate 10 years from now, even if we then change the policy 10 years from now, that by then the genie will be out of the bottle, and it would be hard to put it back, because some of these other ecosystems would have developed. So it's not just the absolute numbers of 20, 25,000 people that would want to stay here are forced to leave, which is roughly the number per year. It's the broader impact of that, and at some point you can't turn back the tide.
If we were to do a big comprehensive solution in 2013, in one sense it would be an anomaly in American history. I mean, if you look back at the classic histories of immigration, most of our most expansive, welcoming, opening moments have been when the economy is doing well and average people are getting ahead. The best example being the 1965 law, fundamentally in the midst of the boom that was going on through the 1960s. So if you were sitting here if you were sitting here in Toledo, Ohio, and it was a room of folks who are like feeling that their opportunities are less than their parents had, and they're worried that one of the reasons that's so is because we're letting in people, or we're going to be legalizing people. What is the case to people who are concerned that comprehensive immigration reform will be a threat to their economic well-being?
I understand the concern, and a lot of it is fear based on economic situation for many families that is they're struggling. And the idea that somehow they can't find a job and we're going to make it easier for somebody else to get a job, it's a tough argument. People are feeling some pain and are angry about it and resentful about it. So something that they think somebody else is getting a job they otherwise would have is a tough battle. The way I'd frame it, in the last 90 days, I have been in Detroit and Cleveland and Des Moines and Atlanta, a lot of cities, because I think there's a rise of the rest regionally where it goes back to this entrepreneurial ecosystem thing. It's not just about Silicon Valley. There are a lot of great entrepreneurial companies being created in regions all across the nation, and it's a big opportunity. So I'm spending a lot of time chairing the Startup America initiative on that. But in Detroit, what dawned on me when I was there 6 or 8 weeks ago was 50 years ago, Detroit was Silicon Valley. It was the most vibrant entrepreneurial region in the nation, perhaps the world. In the last 50 years, and that was fueled, by the way, by immigrant entrepreneurs like Henry Ford. In the last 50 years, it's lost 50% of its population. Why did that happen? Well, they lost their entrepreneurial mojo in a global world that got more competitive. So they lost market share, lost jobs, and lost half their population. So if you're in Detroit, my answer would be, how do we make sure we create here the next Ford Motor Company that is going to create lots of jobs for lots of different people with lots of different skill sets? If we don't do it, somebody else will in some other nation, because the trends in terms of opportunities everybody sees globally, capital flows globally. So we need to kind of win those battles, and that's the place to focus in terms of jobs. And immigration reform is part of that, because it's not I don't even like the word immigration. I like the word talent. How do you focus on talent? How do you focus on developing talent yourself on the education side? How do you focus on recruiting talent globally? How do you make sure every organization, every company, every country has the best possible mix of talent working together in the most productive possible way? So it's a national policy around talent, not just a policy around immigration. And the focus should, I think, be more on encouraging people that we want to come here and stay here, not just worrying about the people who are here and what to do about them. It's sort of it's framed as a negative argument. I think it can be reframed as more of a positive argument. But I said at the beginning, my prism is mostly the economy. I recognize the pragmatics of the policy, but I also think there is a moral dimension here that also needs to be taken into account. But different people will be motivated by different things. If I was talking to somebody in Detroit, I likely would lead with the economic argument.
All right, well, good. Let's bring in the audience for some questions. I don't know if there's a microphone.
So what we want to do again is
Oh yeah, I think we're going to get them in writing, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Get them in writing and pass them up to the runners who are around. While we're gathering the questions, had one question, actually for both of you.
All right.
Combination of demographics as well as how to engage the high-skill business community. So and Ron, you've written some great pieces on the graying of America as well as how America is becoming younger and younger. Right. Running through that, but then especially within the high-skill economy, how dependent it is upon young entrepreneurs. And how do we, as a range of perspectives, engage the high-skill advocacy community on this issue around immigration?
Well, maybe I'll start. I mean, I have felt that the fundamental political challenge of the 21st century, within the context of this just overall polarization that we are struggling with, is that we have a demographic corollary or reinforcement of the ideological polarization that we're living through. In that, the two dominant generations in American life now, the two largest generations, are the millennials and the baby boomers. The millennials are the most diverse generation in American history. Over 40% of them are non-white. 47% of the population under 18 is non-white. We're going to be majority non-white in our under 18 population, not in 2040 or 2050, but as soon as a decade from now. And by and large, this is a generation that correctly, I think, believes that it needs public investment in things like education and healthcare to get whether it's the parents believing they need it for their kids or the young people themselves believing they need that to get into the middle class. The other giant generation in American life is the baby boom. And then the silent generation beyond them. Because we did not have any immigration between 1924 and 1965, basically, we largely cut it off, the baby boom is a preponderantly white generation. 80% of today's seniors are white and will remain so. The share of seniors who are white will decline only very slowly over the next several decades. So we have, in effect, the brown and the gray. And they have very inimical view. They have very divergent views about what the path forward is in the country. And you saw that in the election, where upwards of 70%, well over 70% of young people, of minorities under 30, and 80% of minorities overall, voted for President Obama. Over 60% of white seniors voted for Mitt Romney. All the polling, older whites being very skeptical of government spending. The challenge is convincing people or showing people that, as is often the case, we are more interdependent than we realize. In that, and I think you would agree with this, unless we do a better job of getting more of those young people through education, through high school, through college, into middle-class jobs, there's going to be nobody to pay the payroll taxes to fund the Social Security and Medicare. You know, people always say politically, will the millennials pay for the baby boom? How long will they pay for the entitlements of the baby boom? The issue is really the opposite. The issue is the baby boom willing to invest in the millennials? And you know, we are at a point where the federal government spends $7 per capita on seniors for every dollar it spends on kids. And ultimately, finding some balance that creates, you know, kind of a generational rebalancing that creates an investment in this heavily diverse younger generation is, I think, critical, not only politically but economically. It's just very hard to imagine true economic security for the gray without economic opportunity for the brown. So I mean, that's kind of the construct in which I see a lot of the political dynamics that we are living through, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on the other half of the question.
I totally agree. It's very, I think it's accurate and articulate. When you talked about sort of the kind of the people, the older, you know, boomers and the younger millennials, it's just not conceptual for me. This is like my family.
Yeah.
I have parents in their 80s and kids in their 20s, and they don't agree on many of these different issues. So I see it kind of firsthand. And the other thing that, in retrospect, I think was a blessing for me, I grew up in Hawaii, which is sort of a melting pot. And when I grew up, I was a minority. And President Obama, actually, we were in high school together at a school in Honolulu. So there's sort of I just grew up, there's like the diversity that you know, it was just there. It just you know.
Was he picked before you on the schoolyard for the basketball games? A little bit.
Well,
a little bit earlier.
I actually was. I'm 3 years older than him.
So you might have got picked
I was
earlier.
a senior when he was a freshman
All right.
in high school. So I do remember playing basketball with him, but I can't remember. I'm sure he got picked before.
Yeah, okay.
And the fact that he's president, even though that's not the case, I'm definitely going to say that.
Yeah, exactly.
When I speak to high school audience now, I say, be careful. You'd be nice to everybody in your high school because they might be president. Then they like, the IRS, the FBI,
Yeah.
all these things that can come after you. So just be nice to everybody.
How about engaging the high-tech community on these issues?
The high-tech community is very engaged on this issue and very frustrated because they have been focused on this issue in some cases for a decade and just feel like it's falling on deaf ears. And I would say, it's counter to the preference of most people in this room, but they're so frustrated that their kind of eyes roll when they hear about comprehensive immigration reform. They just think that means nothing ever is going to get done. So they want to figure out some way, very pragmatically, get something done, and then get something more done and get something more done. So they would be more in the kind of get some points on the board and make incremental progress, and don't kind of wait to do anything until you can do everything. At the same time, there is a strong constituency, I'm sure a lot of people in this room, that do feel like enough already. Let's deal with this and deal with it in a comprehensive way. But it will be harder to engage some folks in the business community if it's framed in the broadest possible context, just because it seems, you know, I wouldn't say it's the impossible dream, but it seems sort of, it just feels so hard and so complicated that it is a little bit harder.
All right. Do you want to read them, or?
Sure. Here, I'll give them to you.
All right, I'll read them. Okay. How broadly do you define talent? Is there room to recognize the people who take the risk of uprooting themselves to pursue a new life by being a construction worker or a plumber or a meat packer are also talented?
Sure, of course, of course. Now, talent is, in the broadest possible context, in any community, any society, any nation, any economy, needs a mix of different skills with the people with different, you know, desires and passions and expertise. So, of course, it's broad. I would say, though, and again, you could criticize me for being too focused on entrepreneurship, but I do have a bias believing that these entrepreneurial companies don't just create jobs for those companies, but then create the jobs in the communities around those companies. I saw that when we started AOL in Tyson's Corner, not too far from here. Started with 30 people. At the peak, it was about 10,000 people. And it transformed the communities around Reston and Dulles and so forth in terms of housing and construction jobs and restaurants and the whole ecosystem around those thousands of people. And then many of the people who had success were very active, involved in the community, philanthropically, and so forth. And the growth there really propelled the region and had a ripple effect that was really quite broad. The counter argument I made around Detroit, when it was basically losing half its population, it also lost, part of the reason it lost its population was not just the Ford Motor Company was contracting, but all the other related businesses that were supporting a vibrant Ford Motor Company were contracting. So the best way to make sure there's construction jobs is to actually have companies expanding, building new buildings, hiring new employees who are going to buy houses or rent houses or apartments or what have you. And the intersection between entrepreneurship and innovation, economic growth, and job creation in the broadest possible context is, to me, kind of not well understood.
Do you realize that what you did in Northern Virginia and the high-tech ecosystem that you helped inspire probably helped, in the long run, tip the state to where it is now a purple state? By the migration and the different kind of people who are now living in Northern Virginia. But here's a related question. Isn't there a danger conflating entrepreneurship with higher skills? Lots of America's new businesses are started by enterprising strivers who may not have strong technical skills. Talk about within this legislation for those entrepreneurial visas, are they in fact tied to advanced education, or is there kind of no direction that way?
There are two parts of it. I'm not an engineer. Right. I'm not, so I started, I'm not going to say that there can't be enterprising people that don't have technical skill. Obviously, there are a lot of companies started by, or people are key contributors to companies without the technical skills. But you cannot argue that these technical skills, the so-called STEM skills, are more important now than they were and are going to be more important in the future than they are now. So doing whatever we can in terms of our education system, as well as in supplementing that around immigration policy is I think, critically important.
One other question. Beyond admission levels, don't we also need to make sure people are treated fairly once they are here? For instance, allowing spouses to unite or spouses to work.
Yeah, I understand that. And it's part of this broader debate, which is why I think just focusing narrowly on high skilled immigration as opposed to looking at in a broader context of broader reform around immigration, I think it's important to look in that broader context. There are a lot of different issues. And again, I'm not an expert in this. I know this amount, and you people in this room probably know quite a bit more. But I do recognize there's some real complexities to this, and trying to understand and build bipartisan support for a reasonable solution that gets reasonable momentum sooner rather than later is a critical ingredient.
And you do wonder if, as you say, I mean, obviously the challenge of doing anything comprehensive in kind of modern Washington is enormous. On the other hand, if the alternative to some pathway to citizenship is somehow removing all of these people from society, that was sort of litigated in this election in many ways by Romney embracing the concept of self-deportation and it finding very little support even in Republican primaries. Only about a third of voters, I think at the high point in states like Florida and Arizona, said they supported the idea of deporting everyone, and obviously in the exit poll on election night, only about 1/3 of the electorate overall. So it's sort of like, after you tried all the other alternatives.
No, I think that's why I'm hopeful, optimistic that now is the moment and something can get done. I think the notion that people are going to self-deport is crazy. This notion that we're not going to pass something like the DREAM Act and we're going to go round up 2 million teenagers and send them. Of course we're not. They in most cases don't even know the country they came from. This is the country that they feel part of and want to stay in and want to contribute to, and they're trying to serve in the military, get an education, and give back to this nation. We're not going to do that. I think everybody knows that. So let's just be honest about that and focus on we are where we are. You can debate exactly how we got here, and maybe this could have been different or that could have been different. It doesn't really matter. We are where we are. How do we move forward in a constructive, collaborative, responsible way to make sure we deal with this issue around talent, around people, and not just in a counting the quotas here, or how do we make sure we're creating or continuing to have the kind of nation that we've had for 200 years? As I said at the very beginning, I think the story of America is the story of entrepreneurship and the story of immigration. It is why we are what we are. It's why we have this leading economy, and we should learn from that, celebrate that, and make sure the next 200 plus years build on that, and move beyond some of these kind of sharp sometimes even hostile kind of political debates, kind of talking points on cable news shows, and say here is the context of where we are. There's a handful of different alternatives. Let's look responsibly at those different alternatives and agree as a nation on a path forward that deals with this issue not just as a problem to be solved, but as an opportunity to make sure we can build on what we've seen in the story of the last 200 years and make sure the next 200 years is better than not worse.
Entrepreneurship and immigration is kind of the double helix of our DNA.
Exactly.
Well, listen, this has been a fascinating conversation. Join me in thanking Steve Case.
Thank you all for being here.
And we return you to your regularly scheduled programming. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Stephen. We'll take another break and come back in about 15 minutes. Steve, that was great. Thanks. Thank you very much. Really appreciate that.
All right, you want your stuff back? Yes. Yeah.